November 16th, 1957. The small town of Plainville, Wisconsin. Population, maybe 700. A hardware store clerk named Bernice Worden doesn't show up for work. Her son, Frank Worden, who also happens to be the local deputy, swings by the store to check on her. He finds the register open, blood on the floor, and she's nowhere to be found. Frank starts asking around. The last person seen near the store? Ed Gein. Quiet guy, odd. Neighbors refer to him as harmless. Frank and the sheriff drive out to Ed's farmhouse to have a talk. They knock. Nobody answers, so they go inside. And that's when it stops being a missing persons case and becomes something the officers there that night never fully recover from. Bernice Worden was in the shed, decapitated. Frank's mom hanging upside down from the ceiling by her heels, field dressed like a deer. And that was just the shed. What they found in the house, nobody had words for it because nobody had ever seen anything like it. Welcome. I'm your host, Nick, and this is Behind the Horror. Today we're looking at the man behind three of the most iconic horror villains ever put on screen: Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. One guy, one rundown farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, and a level of evil so specific, so strange, so deeply domestic that Hollywood has spent 60 years trying to fully capture it. And honestly, they never quite got there. Here's the question. How many times have you watched Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs? If you're anything like me, probably too many times to count, and I've got the tattoos to prove it. But here's the thing. These are three completely different movies, different directors, different decades, different monsters. And yet every single one of them has its DNA wired back to the same source. One real guy, one real farmhouse, one set of crimes so bizarre, so unlike anything investigators had ever documented, that filmmakers kept going back to that well for 30 years because there was always more horror left to pull out of it. That's Ed Gein. And he is, and I mean this, one of the most influential figures in the history of horror. And most people don't actually know the entirety of his story. You know the characters he inspired, but you don't know Ed. Let's fix that. You can't tell the story of Ed Gein without starting with his mother. Mommy issues. Am I right? In this case, Augusta Gein is the real story. Ed was born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was the second son. His father, George Gein, was a drunk, unreliable, checked out, barely present in either boy's life. Augusta more than made up for it. Devoutly Lutheran, fundamentalist level devout. The kind of religious where the word of God isn't comfort, it's a weapon. And she pointed that weapon at Ed and his older brother Henry every single day. The wickedness of the world. Women as a source of corruption and sin. Temptation hiding around every corner. And then, in 1914, she moved the family to a 195-acre farm in Plainville. Isolated, deliberate. She did not want the boys contaminated by the outside world. Ed and Henry were allowed to leave the property for school, and that was it. No outside world unless Augusta approved it, which she almost never did. Now, Ed worshipped her completely and without question. See, Ed was a shy, strange kid. People noted that he had an odd laugh, and he struggled to read social situations, and he didn't quite connect with other people the way normal folks did. Augusta was the only relationship that made sense to him. She was his whole world, literally his whole world. His older brother Henry started pushing back as they got older, started questioning their mother's hold on them. He tried to explain to Ed that maybe Augusta wasn't the saint she presented herself to be. We know they argued about it. In 1944, Ed and Henry were burning off unwanted vegetation on the property when the fire got out of hand. When it was over, Henry was dead. The official ruling was asphyxiation from the fire. Accidental. Here's what the official ruling glossed over. Ed told police he and Henry had gotten separated during the fire. Then he led police directly to Henry's body. The body was face down, away from the burned area, with injuries to his head that had nothing to do with the fire. Let that sit for a second. His brother, the only person who had ever pushed back against Augusta's hold on Ed, ends up dead in a field with head wounds in a spot that didn't burn, and Ed somehow knows exactly where to find the body. Nobody looked too hard at it. After all, it was ruled accidental. Then, in 1945, Augusta had a stroke, followed by another one, and then she died. And just like that, Ed Gein, 39 years old, never having lived alone a single day in his life, was completely by himself on a 195-acre farm in the middle of Wisconsin. The only person he ever loved, gone. What happened next took 12 years to fully come to light. Ed kept the farmhouse exactly the way his mother left it. Her bedroom, her sitting room, sealed off, preserved like shrines. He lived in the kitchen and one small room off it, and let the rest of the house exist as kind of a museum to his mother, which sounds sad and strange until you find out what the museum eventually contained. He started reading about death cults, Nazi experiments, reading medical textbooks, pulp magazines. Ed developed a deep consuming interest in human anatomy, what bodies looked like, how they worked, what you could do with them. And at some point, he started acting on it. Ed began visiting the local cemetery at night, reading obituaries, finding women who reminded him of his mother, and digging up their corpses. By his own admission, he visited the cemetery dozens of times over roughly a decade. And here's what I keep coming back to. For years, that was it. Nobody got hurt. Nobody disappeared. He was a deeply disturbed guy who robbed graves and then went back to being odd but harmless Ed, the guy who babysat the neighbor's kids, ran errands for people, and fixed things when asked. People called him a little off, sure, but harmless. Then, in December 1954, a tavern owner by the name of Mary Hogan disappeared from her bar in Pine Grove, about 30 miles from Plainville. There was blood on the floor. Eventually, the case went cold. But something had shifted in Ed. He went from disturbing the dead to ending the living. And to this day, nobody has a clear answer for what flipped that switch in 1954. 3 years later, Bernice Worden, hardware store, November 16th, 1957. I want to be straight with you about something. I've read a lot of accounts of what was found in the farmhouse, and I'm going to tell you what was actually documented, not the stuff that's been embellished over the decades, because there's plenty of that. Just what the officers and investigators put in their official reports. Believe me, it was enough. The first thing people always mention is the smell. The officers who went into the farmhouse described it as something they'd never encountered before and will never forget. Every account, every interview, the smell comes up first. Before anything they saw, the smell hit them when they walked in the front door, and most of them said they carried it with them for a long time after. Then they started looking around. 4 noses in a paper bag, a wastebasket made of human skin, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, intact, eyelids and all, human skulls with the tops sawed off and used as bowls, a chair upholstered in human skin, leggings made from human leg skin, 9 preserved faces mounted on the wall of his bedroom like hunting trophies, a vest constructed from the torso of a woman, complete with breasts, that Ed had apparently made for himself to wear. And Bernice Worden's head, they found it in a burlap sack. In total, investigators believe the remains came from approximately 15 women, pulled from graves and from his 2 confirmed victims. He was only ever charged with 2 murders, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He confessed to both. Here's the detail I can't get away from, though. When they found Ed that night, he wasn't on the run. He wasn't hiding. He was at the neighbor's house, having dinner. He'd been there for hours, a perfectly normal evening at the table with people he knew, while Bernice Worden's headless body hung in his shed just a few miles away. When officers brought him in and told him what they'd found, Ed Gein was calm. He was pleasant. He cooperated with the investigators. He even, at certain points, offered to help them find things. He offered to help them inventory his own house of horrors. Ed Gein was arrested November 16th, 1957. Before his property could go to auction, the farmhouse burned to the ground. The cause was suspicious, but nobody was ever charged. The fire chief at the time? Frank Worden. Sounds like Ed wasn't the only one with mommy issues. Ed was declared mentally incompetent and committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. He sat there for 10 years before he was found competent enough to stand trial. In November 1968, 11 years after his arrest, Ed Gein was tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. The jury took 1 hour. Guilty. The judge immediately vacated the verdict and entered a finding of not guilty by reason of insanity. Ed went back to the institution. He died there on July 26, 1984. Heart failure, complications from lung cancer. He was 77. Ed's body is buried in Plainville. His gravestone was repeatedly vandalized over the years, people chipping pieces off his souvenirs. And then in 2000, it was stolen outright. Found in 2001 in Seattle, of all places. And it was put in storage. As far as I know, it's never gone back. Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. Because none of the directors who drew from Ed Gein ever claimed to be making a documentary. And they all went somewhere different. Psycho, 1960. I'll tell you the moment from that movie I will never forget. And it's not the shower scene. Everybody says the shower scene. It's not even the reveal of Norman's mother. The mummified corpse in the basement. Yeah, that's disturbing. But that's not the moment. It's at the very end. Norman Bates sitting in the police station. They've got him. It's over. And he looks at the camera, calm, still, and you hear his mother's voice inside his head, narrating, taking over. She's been dead for years, and she's still running the show. And Norman, or what's left of Norman, is just sitting there, smiling at you, vacant. That's the moment. Robert Bloch was living in Wisconsin when the Gein story broke in 1957. He was a horror writer and read everything coming out of Plainville that had to do with the case. He wrote his novel in 1959. Alfred Hitchcock bought the rights for $9,000 under a pseudonym and made the film the same year. Norman Bates gets the mother obsession, the fractured identity, the quiet, weird neighbor exterior. But what Hitchcock understood, what that final image captures, is that the truly disturbing thing about Ed Gein wasn't what he did to his victims. It was, to him, Augusta never actually died. She just moved inside him. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of the first horror movies I ever watched. I was probably like 12, and I was so scared that I turned it off before it ended. I had nightmares about Leatherface for months. And I'm not even slightly embarrassed about that because that movie was horrifying. Tobe Hooper and Kim Hinkle explicitly cited Gein as a primary influence for the movie. And this is where they get the body horror to breathe in a way that Hitchcock couldn't in 1960. The furniture made of bones and skin, the masks, the rural isolation, the sense that you drove down the wrong road and stumbled into a place where normal rules stopped applying a long time ago. The mask that Leatherface wore, made out of human skin. That's documented Gein. Photographed by investigators in 1957, Hooper took the physical reality of what was found in that farmhouse and turned it into a family, a whole ecosystem of that kind of evil. The reason 12-year-old me turned it off is the same reason it works. It doesn't give you space. There's no clever distance. There's no place to hide. It just puts you in that house. Silence of the Lambs, 1991. I will never forget Buffalo Bill sitting at his sewing machine. He's casual, singing to himself, just a guy working on a project. Everything looks weirdly normal. And then faintly you hear it. A woman's voice calling for help, crying, terrified. And that's when we see her trapped in the well in Buffalo Bill's basement. And he doesn't react. He just keeps sewing, keeps humming along. That's it. That's the whole scene. And it was so disturbing that it still sticks with me because it's not the monster raging. It's the monster on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas Harris has cited Gein as being part of the inspiration for Buffalo Bill, specifically the skin suit, the psychological concept of a man so at war with his own identity that he literally wanted to wear someone else's. Ed's vest, that detail went directly into Buffalo Bill's project. This deranged idea of building a woman's suit from the inside out. 3 movies, 3 completely different angles from the same source. Psychological horror, physical horror, and identity horror. And what connects all 3? The thing that those filmmakers understood is the specific, suffocating dread of evil that looks like nothing. Evil that's quiet. Evil that offers to carry your groceries for you. Here's what got under my skin when I went down this rabbit hole. Everyone, and I mean everyone, defaults to Augusta when they try to explain Ed Gein. The domineering mother, the isolation, his inability to connect with other people. The theory is basically Augusta broke him, and what followed was a man so unable to process grief and his own identity that he built the most disturbing possible substitute for everything she'd taken from him. It's a clean narrative, and it's probably not entirely wrong, but I want to push on something. Augusta died in 1945. The grave robbing started shortly after, but the first confirmed murder wasn't until 1954, almost a decade later. And here's the distinction that nobody makes enough. Ed Gein wasn't obsessed with murder. He was fascinated by death, by dead things, by the physicality of a corpse. For almost 10 years, not a single living person was harmed. Something shifted in 1954. He escalated across a line he hadn't crossed before, and we don't know what the catalyst was. And here's the other thing I'd push on. Everything we know about Augusta, the religious fanaticism, the way she isolated the boys, the weapon-grade guilt she wielded, almost all of it comes filtered through Ed's account, through people who knew Ed, through a psychological portrait built after the fact to explain something that needed explaining. Augusta was dead before any of this came to light. She never got a chance to say a word in her own defense. Now, this doesn't mean the portrait is wrong, but it's worth noting the most convenient explanation for Ed Gein, the one that makes him make the most sense, is built entirely on the testimony of a man who made furniture out of people. As for Ed himself, psychiatrists who spent significant time with him described him as genuinely hard to categorize. He was passive, cooperative. He expressed what appeared to be real remorse. He tended a garden at the hospital. He was, by multiple accounts, a model patient. A psychiatrist testified at trial that Gein may have not known whether killing Worden was intentional or accidental. Ed's own account was that he'd been examining a rifle at the store when it discharged. He claimed he didn't remember what happened next. Whether that's psychological blocking, manipulation, or the truth, nobody will ever know. He was sitting at a neighbor's dinner table when they arrested him. He'd been sitting there for hours, a normal evening, while Bernice Worden was hanging decapitated in his shed. How do you hold both of those things in your head at the same time? You don't. That's the answer, which is exactly why horror writers and filmmakers keep coming back to this story, because Ed Gein doesn't resolve. There's no satisfying explanation at the bottom of him, no moment where it all clicks into place. There's no final answer. In the end, there's just a simple man and a farmhouse full of horrors in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. Here's my take. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments. The thing that makes Ed Gein more terrifying than any movie monster isn't the body count. It's not the isolation. It's not even Augusta. It's the domestic feel of everything. He made soup bowls out of human skulls. He made a vest out of a human. He took things that no human being should ever possess and integrated them into the physical rhythms of daily life. And then he continued having a daily life. He shopped in town. He fixed things for neighbors. He babysat their children. The horror filmmakers all understood something about that the specific dread Ed Gein produced wasn't the chase or the jump scare. It was the thing sitting quietly in the room with you that you hadn't quite identified yet. Norman Bates runs a motel. He's pleasant. He offers you milk and sandwiches. Leatherface lives in a house in the country that if you were lost, you might stop by and ask for directions. Buffalo Bill invites you in while somebody is crying in his basement and just keeps right on sewing. Ed Gein taught horror that the monster already knows where you live and Probably helps you carry the groceries in once or twice. The officers at that farmhouse on November 16th, 1957, gave interviews over the years, and almost every single one of them said some version of the same thing. It wasn't what they saw that stayed with them. It was realizing how long it had been going on, how many times they'd probably waved to him at the gas station, how normal he seemed. That's the one they keep going back to. And that is the horror behind the horror. If you guys want to go deeper on this one, and fair warning, it gets heavy, I'll link the source material in the description. Harold Schechter's biography, Deviant, is the most comprehensive account out there, and it's one hell of a read. If you haven't already seen Psycho and you want to see how Hitchcock translates all of this into something a 1960s audience could actually sit with, you already know what to watch. Do me a favor and hit subscribe if this is your thing. And feel free to drop a comment with the horror rabbit hole you want me to go down next. There's no shortage of material. Trust me, I've been down most of them. I'm Nick, and this has been Behind the Horror.